This video is about generalized practical solutions in PF. I made another video with Amadea a while ago about a similar topic, and I kind of yap about it every single interview that I release. But I want to sit down and actually make a formal video to explain my thoughts so that you have something that you can actually understand and something that I can defend against some of the naysayers out there. So here is my position. My position is that the following examples, at least one of them, are useful responses. The first example is on the Taiwan defense topic. They say on the neg that if we reduce arms sales to Taiwan, we'll give them to Saudi Arabia. But we say a practical solution would just be to not give them to Saudi Arabia. So this is not a legitimate con of the topic of reducing arms sales to Taiwan. The second example is on the nuclear energy topic for April. They say on the neg again that if we invest more in nuclear energy, we will inevitably dump some waste in indigenous land. We say this is not true, since we could just put the waste somewhere else that is not indigenous land, which is an easy practical solution. This is not, therefore, an argument against nuclear energy, it's an argument against dumping waste on indigenous land. In other words, it's not intrinsic to the topic, it's not a legitimate con of increasing nuclear energy. What do I need to do to prove that these examples are useful responses? I think there are 5 things that I need to do reasonably. If you think that there are extra ones, let me know in the comments. The first one I definitely need to do is I have to establish that the rules allow for generalized practical solutions on the pro, since this is a lot of the basis of my claim that these should be allowed. The answer to this question, do the rules allow this, is yes. If you go to the NSDA rules for public forum as a main event, it has this point number 4 about plans and counterplans. In public forum debate, you're not allowed to have plans and counterplans, which are defined as formalized, comprehensive proposals for implementation. Neither the pro or the con side is allowed something like that. However, you should offer reasoning to support a position of advocacy. And to be clear, they say this part right here. So this sentence in blue is the primary basis for the argument that I'm making today. Debaters may offer generalized practical solutions. I'm interpreting this as something that you are allowed to do on both the pro and the con, since it references both the pro and the con in this sentence above, and it says debaters in general, so it doesn't seem to be specifying that this is something that only the con can do or only the pro can do. Um, there are a few theoretical problems with this. One complaint that I hear is the NSDA rules, or this specific NSDA rule, is not really a rule at all. This is just sort of a guideline. I think this is incorrect. One, this is under the section about main event rules. It's not about main event guidelines. And second, we take everything else in this section very seriously. For example, this is literally the point right below speech times. If it's on the same level playing field as speech times, which is one of those like red lines that judges are not do not allow you to cross, even if you have the best theory arguments, I think that it should be given a serious, serious look. It's also on the same playing field as things about like the resolution, for example. So if we think that the PF rules in the NSDA handbook are the legitimate basis of what topic we should be debating, I think that we should also take this point very seriously as well. The second complaint that people have is that maybe the NSDA rules specifically don't apply to lots of tournaments because some tournaments don't say anything about the NSDA. My thesis is that the NSDA rules provide the most predictable stasis point for how we can define the event of public forum debate. That is, even if a tournament does not explicitly reference the NSDA rules, which, by the way, a lot of them do, and a lot of them reference the NSDA rules by using the topic that the NSDA provides. Even if the tournament does not reference the NSDA rules, my opinion is that if it doesn't give guidelines itself, then the most predictable thing that you can use is the NSDA rules. After all, I think that the definition of public forum debate stems from the NSDA, and to some extent, the definition of public forum debate is here, is this sort of 7-point thing that the NSDA has given. If any tournaments intend to not follow the NSDA rules, I think that in order to make something else more predictable, like the not following of NSDA rules more predictable, they would have to specify that in the tournament invitation. So my opinion is that if they don't specify something in the tournament invitation that explicitly is contrary to the NSDA rules, I think that the NSDA rules should be the default assumption. And you do need a default assumption because these are questions that structure every single debate round. Not everything can be determined by theory because some of these questions are literally about the nature of how the debate is allowed to go in the first place. And given that there are rules that explain how it is allowed, I think that these should be taken very seriously in every single tournament, not just the NSDA nationals. It's also worth noting that almost every major tournament that anyone attends is part of the NSDA, right? Like if they are awarding NSDA points at this tournament, for example, that means that they've been sanctioned by the NSDA. And so I think implicitly they take the NSDA rules to be best practices for that tournament as a result. Number two, debaters should be allowed to do things if they are explicitly allowed by the rules. This one is slightly more controversial, but I think this is actually a pretty strong point for me. There are two reasons that I would give for why debaters should always be allowed to do things if they're explicitly allowed by the NSDA rules. The first one is predictability. I think predictability is one of the best voters in any theory argument at all because it sort of is a prerequisite to most of the other things that are going on, and it's probably the best internal link into things like fairness. Specifically, what I mean is that if something is unpredictable, like you don't know what rules you should be adhering to when you're preparing for the event to begin with, then I think that it sort of breaks down everything else. The amount of clash that you will have, which is a link into education, is probably worse if we're not operating under the same assumptions of what event that we're doing. You think that we're doing policy, but I think we're doing public forum. That's something that needs to be resolved before we can get into anything else. And so I think that if something is explicitly allowed by the rules are the most predictable basis of anything. And so I think that that's the first step that we need to address. So if it is allowed by the rules, I think that it certainly should be allowed in any debate round that's following those rules. The second reason is because of jurisdiction. Even if theoretically this rule is unfair, or it's like a bad rule, it's still the rule. And I think that the judge is constrained by the rules to some extent. Like they should be guided by the rules. The way that I think about judge jurisdiction is kind of like what jurisdiction does a math teacher have when they're grading your test? Or what jurisdiction does a referee have when they're like trying to be a referee in a game of basketball? They're always guided by the rules first and foremost. Of course, they can make other decisions possibly as well, but most of the decisions have to be within like valid interpretation of the rules. And the reasoning for this is pretty simple. It's because, in my opinion, there is a constitutive element of public forum debate that is made up of the rules. That is, public forum debate is no longer public forum debate if it does not adhere to the NSDA rules for public forum debate. Just like it would be maybe it's a cooler game for people who are playing soccer to be allowed to pick the ball up with their hands, but then it's no longer soccer. And so the referee has an obligation to call them out for doing that. But the referee, by the same standard, also has an obligation not to allow one team to arbitrarily disallow the other team from like kicking the ball in a certain way, for example. So in my opinion, uh, based on their participation in the tournament to begin with, the judges are implicitly agreeing to a code of conduct that includes their ruling based on the rules. So I think the jurisdiction argument is quite strong, and I think it's constitutive to the event of debate. The next thing I should address, which, in my opinion, to be clear, is something that is below the first two theoretical standards, but I'll still address it, is some other theoretical concerns. I think these are actually quite weak arguments against the use of generalized practical solutions. One is about fairness. Like, for some reason, it's unfair for you to make a generalized practical solution to an argument. I think there are two reasons that this one is just not at all a good argument. One is because of symmetry. Both sides get to use generalized practical solutions, both on the pro and the con. It's unclear to me why, just because I knew about them and I'm actually prepared them, that I'm at like such a big advantage over you that it makes the entire playing field unfair. Given that we both have equal access to the strategy, I don't think that fairness is a legitimate argument. The second thing is that I don't think that this argument is OP, as in like it cannot be applied to every single piece of offense on either side. It is not terminal when it's applied in most cases, and it only works very well against arguments that are pretty weak and intuitively it should work against. Which means I don't think that this is a cause for concern. I don't think that this massively skews the round in one direction or another. The second theoretical concern that could exist is about education, but I actually think this is a point in favor of generalized practical solutions because this is how people argue in the real world. Like when policymakers or people are talking about policymakers, they're always talking about what they should do, and they always introduce generalized practical solutions. I'll give one example. If we were debating about whether or not you should take a trip on your vacation to Vietnam, if you made a neg argument, there was a disad to going to Vietnam, and your argument is, well, if I go to Vietnam, it is likely that I will hop on a moped and I will crash the moped because I don't have very much experience with mopeds and they're very dangerous in Vietnam. Obviously, the intuitive response to anyone who is not in public forum debate already, who is not steeped in the norms that currently exist, the intuitive response to anyone, my mom, for example, would say this, is just don't hop on the moped. That's such an obvious response, and it is a generalized practical solution to the disad, which proves that it's not an intrinsic con of going to Vietnam or taking a vacation to Vietnam. Even if you think that you're likely to do this, I could just tell you don't. That's an easy solution, and it would prevent you from doing this. Another example is, let's say I want you to go to the grocery store so that you can bring back some groceries and we can stock our fridge. If your argument is no, if I go to the grocery store, my phone will die halfway through the trip and I won't be able to find my way there. Obvious response is just charge your phone. Like, just bring a portable charger. Here, I'll give you one, right? This is a generalized practical solution that is the intuitive first response that you would think of in your mind for any impartial observer of a debate event. I think that probably our logic that we use in debate should parallel the logic that we use in the real world and should parallel the intuitions of normal people, especially given the purpose of public forum in the first place, which was to be created as an event that is easy to understand and intuitive for the average person. So in my opinion, this is actually better for education because it better approximates real world debates instead of this weird, magical, constrained version of debate that is not actually something that stems from the rules. There's like maybe a few other theoretical concerns. One of them is that it's like too late in the debate. I don't really understand this at all. It's logically false that this is too late in the debate. Specifically, what I'm addressing is some people say, oh, this is like a shifting of your advocacy. I think that this concern stems from thinking about public forum as if it's policy. Public forum is not policy. We don't have a plan. I still agree with that. And the generalized practical solution is not the same thing as a plan, very explicitly. The reason that it's different is because you're not specifically giving an advocacy of what you're going to do in the policy. You are just giving solutions to possible negatives of the policy. So, for example, this is inherently responsive. This is inherently reactive to the problems that the other side might bring up. Um, that means it has to be in a later speech. It can't be in the first speech unless you're preempting something. And so logically, if this is a response to their arguments, it's like they bring up a problem with doing this, and you are responding to that problem by saying it's not actually a problem with this because we don't have to do it in that way, or there's a easy logical solution to this. Then intuitively, the first speech that it makes any reasonable sense to bring this up in is probably the rebuttal speech. So how can it possibly be too late if this is the first possible speech you have to introduce this kind of argument? The last thing that I'll note is I don't think any of this matters at all because I don't think that generalized practical solutions are going to run into a lot of theory shells in the first place. Because the way that you should be running these in a debate, if you're smart, is to make them as innocuous as possible. You shouldn't say like, oh, I'm making a brand new kind of argument that I know you might not like it, but it's called a generalized practical solution, and it's going to completely change this debate in a way you've never heard of before. Because that would obviously invite them to run a theory argument if they think that something is up that's different from how they normally are interpreting debate. So I think that instead, you should make it a normal response, like a normal person, and just be like, one of our responses is just an obvious solution to this is this. For example, these examples are good examples that do this. They're pretty innocuous, and I think that they don't necessarily like most people would not be inclined to run theory against these as their first instinct. Which means in most of these rounds, you shouldn't have to worry about theory at all, especially given that judges shouldn't change the way that they judge theory just because this is a new kind of argument that they haven't heard before. So new theory arguments in later speeches are new, they're too late, and so it shouldn't matter if they bring them up in later speeches. The third burden that I have, so now hopefully you think that I've proven the rules allow for this and we should be allowed to do things that are allowed by the rules. So, okay, we're allowed to do this. Who cares? Um, the problem is we need to make sure that this is actually a version of a generalized practical solution. Because one complaint you might have is you might say, yes, this theoretical construct of a generalized practical solution is allowed, but these examples are not that. These examples are not generalized practical solutions. And this might be something that you run into if you attempt this strategy, because it is a bit of a fuzzy, like there's not a clear line of what counts as a generalized practical solution. So I think that there's maybe 4 ways that you can do this, maybe like 3.5 ways that you can do this to explain why these arguments are in fact generalized practical solutions. The first one is a proof by definition. So just look up the Merriam-Webster definition for generalized and practical, and if it meets both of those criteria, you're done. The second one is a proof by presumption. This one, I think maybe I actually like slightly better because I don't know why there is an assumption that you have the burden of proving that this is a generalized practical solution. For example, in policy, you don't have to justify why your plan is actually a plan. You just give it, and then if they think it's not topical, then they will respond to it and they will read T or something like that, or they'll say this is not a plan. It's not on you necessarily. The only reason that it would be on you is because you think you adopt that burden because this is an argument that is not very common in public forum, which I think is totally arbitrary. In fact, I think that the proper burden is on them. There's a burden of rejoinder that says, like, they must prove that this is not a generalized practical solution to prove that you have violated the rules in some way. I think you're innocent until proven guilty, and I think that that logic applies in this scenario as well. And I think that this is a pretty easy way to debate it. If they don't give reasons why this is not a generalized practical solution, I think you should default that it is a generalized practical solution. And so all you need to do is defend it against claims that it is something else. Most of those claims will be attempting to persuade the judge that this is actually a plan or this is actually a counterplan. I think these are easy enough to answer if you draw like logical distinctions and you give examples of what actually would have been a plan and how that's clearly different from what you're doing. The next one is a proof by reasonability. I actually think this is fine, but some people might not like it. The idea is just like if you can give enough examples, these are like different flags that the judge has, and whichever one you're nearest to um, would firmly set this on that side. I get what I mean to be clear is like you can give an example on one extreme of something that is clearly a plan and a counterplan, and you can give an example on the other extreme of something that is clearly a generalized practical solution. And then you just have to prove that your thing reasonably is like closer to that one than the other extreme. Um, and I think that this is a pretty easy way to do things. Technically, it's not as rigorous, right? You don't have a line that you've defined of what is in the middle, like at what point does it become a generalized practical solution? But I don't think you need this. In fact, I think it's impossible to give a line for when something like goes from being a counterplan to a generalized practical solution, for example. That line just doesn't exist. But you don't need that line to exist if you prove that you are firmly on one side of it and not firmly on the other one. It's kind of like the color red. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but I think that it actually makes intuitive sense. The last one is a proof by competing interpretations. This is like half because it's basically the proof by definition again. But this is basically handling it like you would do a T debate. So my interpretation of what it means to have a generalized practical solution is better than yours because it's like it's more debatable or it's more accurate to the words. Obviously, the accuracy question is probably also just proof by definition, but there's a secondary question of which one is more debatable. And so you can, to some extent arbitrarily, not totally arbitrarily, but to some extent arbitrarily, you can give definitions of what you think the NSDA rules mean when they say plan and counterplan versus generalized practical solution, and what you think the line between them reasonably could be. And then you defend that interpretation of the line against any counter interpretation that they would have of what the line would be instead. But this also puts the burden on them to some extent of providing a different idea of what is a generalized practical solution and what it's not. And importantly, that idea of what is a generalized practical solution, intuitively, it can't just be like nothing, right? If it's nothing, then why the heck is it in the rules in the first place? We can appeal at least to some extent to some framer's intent here. The fourth burden I have to prove is that this response is theoretically useful. Theoretically useful meaning that assuming that a judge buys it, this can help you win around. I think that this is also quite easy. In order to prove this, I have to prove A, that there are circumstances in which you would not win without it. I think that's easy enough. Like you could imagine a circumstance where the opponents respond to every single response that you have on one of their arguments, except this one, and then you go for this one and you say that this is terminal defense and they dropped it, and then the judge votes for you as a result. It does intuitively have the implication of being defense if this is a valid response that you can use. And so I think that yes, there are circumstances in which you would not win without it. B, we have to prove that it is equally, if not more effective than other strategies that have a similar effect. So for example, why would you read a generalized practical solution when you could just read a non-unique or a no-link argument, for example? For example, I could just say, it is unlikely that the US federal government will give these weapons to Saudi Arabia. But my opinion is that this response is harder for them to answer than that one, or at least they might have answers to that one that they don't have to this one. Because, for example, they probably have evidence in their case if they're running this argument that says it is very likely that we will give them to Saudi Arabia. We did this last time, we did this the time before, and here are political reasons why this is likely for the administration. And so I think that those responses, I can escape them a little bit if I read this argument instead, which is slightly different from just saying it's unlikely that this happens, it's unlikely that there's a link. I say that there is no link because this is not intrinsic to the argument, and therefore it's not a valid con, because there is a generalized practical solution that proves that. So I think the answer to both of these, A and B, is yes, which means I have successfully proven that this response is theoretically useful. It could theoretically win you some rounds. The last one is maybe the hardest barrier to overcome. Will it actually win you some rounds? My response is yes. I think judges will take this argument seriously if you do it right. It's notable that the barrier, like the burden I have to overcome to prove this, is actually shockingly low. All I need to do to prove that this is a response that you could put in your arsenal that would be useful is to prove that there's like one judge out there who would actually count this as a response. Because if that's true and it is theoretically useful in front of that judge, then of course you should use it. There's no reason not to. Um, so if I can prove that there's even one judge that would actually take this seriously, then you should use the strategy. There maybe is a problem of guessing which judge that is or which judges will take this seriously. Because if you guess wrong, there's a risk, right? If you use the strategy and you go all in on it, and the judge happens to not be one of those judges who takes it seriously, then you've messed up and you will likely lose the round as a result. So this is a risk because it's probably true that there are some judges out there who will not take this seriously no matter what. But my position is that I think this gamble is actually quite good. I think there are lots of ways that you can tell which judges will vote on this. And in my opinion, it's actually the vast majority if you frame and package the argument correctly. Let's talk about a few different categories of judges. The first one is lay judges. For some reason, people think that these are the ones that they will have the hardest time with this argument. I think it's the total opposite. I think lay judges are free with this argument. Lay judges are judges who don't have any prior intuitions about debate, so they only bring in their prior intuitions about how arguments and logic work outside of the realm of debate. And so if we think about this in terms of how this would go in a real round, in my opinion, what is likely to happen is you introduce this argument nonchalantly, like people normally do, just say like, oh, obviously this is not really a con of nuclear energy because we could just not put it on native land. Then maybe the opposing side responds. Likely they won't because they don't really understand what this argument means. If they do respond, the response is likely to just be a complaint. Like they'll say, oh, this is not how public forum debate works. Already, that's a pretty difficult argument to sell to a judge. You're asking them to win an argument that is essentially theory against an argument that sounds pretty intuitive out the gate. And so there's a pretty high barrier, a pretty high burden that they have to overcome to win that you should just throw this argument out entirely because it like doesn't follow the rules of debate. Now, this is where I think the lay judges will side with you even more. If the debate does, at the end, become a scuffle about if this is allowed by the rules, you will always win because lay judges do not trust their own evaluation of how debate works very well, as they shouldn't because they haven't been in the activity for very long. And so their understanding of the norms will not be very complete. So instead, they will always rely on their understanding of the rules by the text of the rulebook. And so if you hand them the NSDA rulebook and you're like, literally just go read this, it is right there. You can see it with your own eyes. They will have indisputable proof that you are correct and your opponents are incorrect. And so it will be an auto win for you every time. Lay judges especially love the NSDA rules because they give them a source of confidence around their decision. Oftentimes, lay judges, they don't want to make the wrong decision and they're scared of making the wrong decision. And they're scared of being misled by one debater or another. And so giving them this source of predictability of what is actually right, what is sanctioned by people who are above us and who are above them, the NSDA committee or whatever, gives them a very strong source that they can trust that will always help them vote for you. So I think that if they don't respond to your argument, obviously it's easy. The judges will not intervene against it because it's very intuitive. And if they do respond to your argument and they complain about it with theory, it's even easier because you can just hand the judges the rule book and they will see with their own eyes that this is in fact allowed. There's also some good empirical evidence that this is the case. For example, people do this all the time at local tournaments. Like literally in LD, for example, but also in PF, all the time, you'll hear stories about these teams making arguments that they think are intuitive because they haven't gone to the national circuit and experienced national circuit norms that are just like, just don't do that. I've had students do this without learning anything about debate. It's one of the first arguments that your brain jumps to before you learn about how public forum works. So I think for lay judges, it's the same. Also, the other empirical evidence is just an anecdote. I've been teaching here in Taiwan. I taught some teachers who were thinking about teaching debate to their own students, and we had them do like a little mock debate. One of the first responses that they came up with was just don't put the waste in native land. If these teachers, who also will go to judge these tournaments and probably become, by our standards, lay judges, if they are thinking of this argument as one of the first responses that comes to their mind, clearly this is pretty strong evidence that lay judges in general will not, at the very least, auto reject this argument. And in fact, I think will very much accept this argument as something that they have thought of themselves as well. To me, I think it's maybe even more confusing to them that they don't hear this argument. So then the other group of judges we have to deal with is tech judges. I think lay judges totally will be sold on this argument. Will tech judges be sold? I think that the answer is yes. You just have to package it differently. I think that tech judges will love this argument if you do it right. There's two reasons that this is true. One is that lots of tech judges identify, or at least they self-identify, right, as being tabula rasa, as being non-interventionist judges who just allow the debaters to do their thing, and then they only decide based on what the debaters said in the round and who's right in the round. So most of these tech judges, if they are so non-interventionist, should not intervene. That's like the whole point of being a tech judge, after all. And so if that is true, then they will not assert their dogma over you and take away your win because of some interpretation that they thought of based on responses to the argument that they thought of that didn't actually happen in the round. The second reason why tech judges will vote for this argument is because this is a new argument, which means most of the time your opponents will not give very good responses or any responses at all in the speech immediately following the argument. If they do make responses, it will often be too late in the round. And tech judges know this. They know that these responses are too late. They will hold the line for you. They will say, even if you believe that there are great responses to this argument, you didn't say them in time. You didn't say them in the right speech. And so functionally, this argument was conceded. So I have to vote for it, even if I don't like voting for it. There's also just lots of different ways you can package these arguments in order to sell them better to tech judges. Maybe there are some ways in which you can give these arguments that tech judges won't like or will confuse tech judges who are really immersed in the current norms of public forum that this seems to disrupt a little bit. And so maybe some of them will be confused and they won't understand what kind of argument you're making because it doesn't adhere to one of the arguments that they've heard before so many times. In this case, I think it's really just about selling it in the back half, being like, listen, this is a different kind of argument. They conceded it. If you think of responses, those responses weren't in the round, and this is theoretically legitimate. It is in the rules. You should check the rule book. So this is a GG. I know that this sounds like a sneaky strategy, but it's not. It's just innovative. You shouldn't punish me for doing something differently, especially if it's in an unpredictable way and you are seriously like a tabula rasa judge or whatever you claim to be. There's also pretty strong empirical evidence that this is true. Like every single person that I've explained this argument to in any interview has said, yes, I will vote for this in a PF round without fail. So, and these are all like people who actually go to PF tournaments and judge these rounds as tech judges. And so if this is true, if we have all of this anecdotal evidence from interviews, and 100% of them, people have said, yes, I would vote for this argument, then I think this is pretty good evidence that they will vote for this argument. Like we should hear them out. We should take them seriously. I think that the greatest risk that they don't vote for this argument is if they're confused and they think that you're trying to pull some tricky stunt. And so you just need to convince them that's not what's happening and you'll be fine. That's all of the things I need to prove that this is a practically useful argument. I think that I've done that. So I think that you should believe this is a practically useful argument, which means maybe you should add it to your arsenal. It won't work every time. In fact, there are lots and lots of cases where it's not applicable. But in those few where it is applicable, it can definitely be the difference between winning and losing. And so why not try it? The whole point of this YouTube series is to teach debaters how to think for themselves and also how to try new things and disrupt the norms, not just stay stagnant and be okay with all of the ways that things happen just because that's the way that things are. We should do things that are new and strategic and innovative. I think this is one of those things. Here's some different points for discussion. Some people got mad at me last time for calling this an intrinsic perm. I think that this is sort of like a problem with jargon inherently, especially jargon from policy. The fact of the matter is, if I call anything by a policy term, people are going to say, oh, you don't actually understand what that policy term means, and this is not an actually correct application of that term. But if I don't call something by the policy term, then people will be like, "Oh, Mac doesn't understand this. He's just making an argument that's just the intrinsic perm, but he doesn't know about the intrinsic perm, so he's not calling it that." I think that it's sort of like a lose-lose situation for me. My decision is largely to stay away from jargon. I think that policy jargon, especially, doesn't have as much of applicability in public forum, especially things like perms. Like maybe this does follow a similar logic to perms, but the concept of a permutation doesn't make very much sense in public forum because we're not doing competing advocacies, right? We're not doing a plan versus counterplan debate. It's literally just talking about the pros or the cons of a policy as it's implemented. And so it doesn't even make sense to have a permutation in that sense, because there's no counterplans to perm, you know? It doesn't really make sense. And so I think that I will avoid calling this the intrinsic perm. I also think technically this definitionally was not an intrinsic perm. Some of the things that Amadea and I talked about were intrinsic perms. But these specifically don't seem like they're intrinsic perms. The reason why is because I was really scratching my head about this for a while. Henry Mitchell, the policy guy I interviewed a while ago, and Amadea and other people like Bennett, they all told me the same thing when I asked them, like, what the heck is an intrinsic perm? My favorite response was this one from Henry, where he said, the plan is Amadea, the counter plan is Henry, intrinsic perm includes Mac. Basically, an intrinsic perm is something that is new, something that is not advocated by the plan originally and was not advocated by the counter plan originally. It's something that is neither of those, so it's a new thing. I guess this is not that because this is just a clarification of what the plan entails. But it's still, again, it doesn't make any sense to talk in these terms because there is no plan. There's never a plan to begin with. So it's not an intrinsic perm. But even if it was a plan, it still wouldn't be an intrinsic perm because this is just a clarification of what the pro is, what the policy actually entails intrinsically. It's not a new thing that you're doing. It's not a new advocacy that you have. That said, there are versions of generalized practical solutions that probably more approximately are intrinsic perms. It doesn't really matter if they are or if they're not. Who cares? I'm just going to call them generalized practical solutions. That said, it maybe is worth it to make a distinction between two kinds of generalized practical solutions: positive ones, which more closely adhere to the logic of intrinsic perms, and negative ones that are some people will like get mad at these and say, oh, that's severance, but it's not. It's just explaining how the con that you're identifying is not an intrinsic con of the topic, because it can be very easily solved by a generalized practical solution that simply does not do the policy in a way that produces that con. So the positive ones are doing something new. Like your argument says that there will be war with China. A generalized practical solution to that is we should just engage in more diplomacy with China. We should set up more hotlines to avoid miscalculation, for example. That would be a positive generalized practical solution because you're introducing something brand new that is completely, it's not really relevant to the actual topic. It is only relevant to the arguments that we're talking about in this debate, and it's an additional thing that we will be doing. I think the miscalc scenario is actually a pretty good example of this, right? Like you think that we're going to be in this terrible hair trigger scenario where like any little miscalculation will cause a nuclear war. Well, in that case, shouldn't we just, set up some good communications that clarify the intention of the other actor? That seems like it would be a generalized practical solution to this that would solve this problem. Um, the negative version is just don't do the policy in that way. So these two at the very top are both examples of negative versions of the generalized practical solution, which nonetheless, in my opinion, do count as generalized practical solutions. Just don't do this thing. Just don't drive the moped in Vietnam, for example. So don't drive the moped in Vietnam is a negative generalized practical solution. Just charge your phone when you're going to the grocery store is an example of a positive generalized practical solution. I think both of them are still practical solutions. However, it's pretty easy to convert a negative one into a positive one. For example, like if your argument is just don't dump the nuclear waste in indigenous land, that's like a negative one. But you could make it a positive one by saying, let's just like have a new policy that bans all waste in indigenous land. Um, it's tricky because that one, the positive one, might no longer be generalized nor practical. It's easier to sell the negative one as being generalized and practical, but they are pretty much, they have the same implication if they are indeed both generalized practical solutions, meaning that every negative one also has a positive counterpart that's just like, do something that bans this instead of just don't do this, right? Like, for example, for the Saudi Arabia example, the positive example would be we should stop selling all weapons to Saudi Arabia. We should like pass a new policy that like puts like an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia or something. Those would be positive examples that have a similar implication on the round. Um, that means that it doesn't really matter that much if it's positive or negative. Who cares, basically? Uh, okay, the next question is there a first mover advantage or a first mover disadvantage? Again, this is to sort of quell some of the fears that people have around reading new positions like this that are innovative. I think the case for the first mover advantage is that you will win against people who are slow to adapt and rigid in their views of debate, which is most of the circuit, to be completely honest. If someone doesn't understand what you're doing and you read a generalized practical solution on them, they just won't have a good response. That's just like the fact of the matter is in 90, I would say 95% of cases, they just won't have a good response at all. This is not something they've ever practiced. This is not something they've ever thought about at all, which is, to be fair, their fault. But it is true. It means that they're unlikely to be able to adapt very quickly. They probably will just misunderstand your response to begin with, and will assume that you mean something else. Or they will just say that this violates the rules and they'll be wrong about that, and that will be an easy slam dunk for you. The first mover disadvantage is that most of these rounds, you will not have a lot of resistance from the opponents. You'll pretty easily win this argument. Any complaints they have later in the round, you'll just be like, those are new responses. It'll be the same as any normal argument. It's just much more likely to be conceded. Instead, you'll mostly be debating the judge. You'll mostly be giving speeches not against the opponent's responses, but preempting the intervention that the judge might have, because that's the most likely way that you might lose this debate. You might be struck down for innovating too close to the sun. So lots of different solutions to this. Five come to mind. One, just don't be extra tricky. What I mean by this is like read the generalized practical solution really slowly. Make it really obvious the first time you read it. Don't be like, also generalized practical solution, you should just not do this. The next response. Don't do that, right? Don't hide it in everything else. Don't put it next to a bunch of other tricky strategies. It should be plain and clear, just given to them on a silver platter. Please respond to this. It's just another argument. And I will read it slowly. I will make it clear. I will make it obvious. I will clarify anything about it. I won't try to hide it or be tricky about it. This makes it more appetizing, more palatable to any kind of judge. So it is always better to do it this way. And there's really no downside because I think the advantage is so strong that it is unlikely that making it very clear what you're doing will actually change the responses the other side gives. The next thing you should do is back half packaging. This is huge. After the response has been conceded, you need to increase the amount of explanation you do about it by like tenfold. If you can, you should bait them to ask questions about it in Crossfire. This is the best thing you could do. Grand Crossfire, 3 minutes on the generalized practical solution is perfect for you because then you make it very clear exactly what they conceded, very clear just how dangerous it is in the round, and very clear that it is totally defensible and any of the responses they're giving in the complaints now are new. And so it's very easy for the judge to evaluate it at the end of the round and easy for them to be like, well, yeah, I guess this argument is sufficient for you to win. And I guess they didn't have any responses. They were early enough to count. And so I can't vote against you because that would be intervention. Makes it very easy for them to tell what's happening. The back half packaging in the summary and final focus is key here. You should say things like, I know this is a new argument that you're unfamiliar with, but you should read the NSDA rules. The first thing you do when you're sitting down to write the RFD is to pull up the NSDA rules and verify for yourself. It's right there. I don't know why they haven't read it and other people haven't read it, because this is a huge thing that will change the way that PF is debated, like we're doing. If you think that our interpretation of these rules is incorrect, they should have said that. That is a response that they should have given. If you think that this is illegitimate, that's a response they should have given. There are also easy responses that they could have given, like this is not generalized or this is not practical, but they chose not to give any of those responses, and instead they just complained that it's not in the rules, which is the one response that they will get wrecked on every single time, which means you can treat this as like, okay, here's the calculus, right? If a judge does not want to vote for this argument, you should understand that and like convert that sadness about voting for this argument from the original narrative, which is I'm sad about this argument, so I don't want to vote for it, into a second narrative that is I'm sad that I have to vote for this argument. I wish you had pointed out these flaws. So it should be like, I'm sad that the opponents made so many mistakes dealing with this clearly bad argument. And then that sadness can be redirected. They can keep the sadness. Who cares? They can keep the frustration, but you get the ballot. And that's how the narrative of the story of the round should go at the end, right? Is even if you think this is a crazy argument, first of all, we don't. It's totally legitimate. But even if you think it is, it's their bad for messing up so bad on it. If you think this is a crazy illegitimate argument, well, like here are all of the things they could have and should have said, but they didn't. It's not unfair. They could have done the same thing on their side, and they could have given all these responses, but they chose to mishandle it. They chose to misunderstand it. And so this is, in this specific round, a free ballot for us. But they should just change the way they deal with it next time to avoid this from happening again. Also, again, there are valid responses. It's useful to point this out to the judge if you think there's a risk of intervention. Like they could have said this, and they could have said this, and they could have said this. Because the highest risk of intervention is if the judge thinks that you're doing something unfair. So I would point out, like, here are all of the responses they should have given, because they would have decked this response and saved their case, but they did not give those responses. So you cannot evaluate them. You have to vote against them. It's not unfair though, because they could have beaten it very easily. And then the last thing is just like blackmail them a bit with their paradigm. Like if you identify as a technical judge, if you identify as non-interventionist, don't do this. Don't intervene. This is the definition of intervention, and so you should not do it. Especially given that it's in the rules. Like it would be crazy for you to intervene on a brand new reading of the rules that was not presented in the round as an interpretation. Is that sounds like the highest form of intervention, especially when there's not a clear like deficit of fairness or education. And even if there was, they should have made that argument like in a speech that was on time, but they didn't. Either way, it's not your role to do this as a judge, right? This is like also not the fight. Like this is not the hill you want to die on. Like why generalize practical solutions that are allowed by the rules? Like this seems like they are pretty educational and pretty fair. So this is not the hill to die on, like, to hack against us. If you are like thinking about intervening and sacrificing your reputation in the process. Um, I think a combination of these is very helpful. Let's take this away from the abstract and give some actual tangible examples. Um, they say nuclear energy will put waste on indigenous land. We say don't put it there. This is type 1. Type 1 is negative GPS. They say, this is the Venezuelan sanctions topic. They say if we don't sanction Venezuela, we will invade them instead. Obvious, just don't invade them. This is type 2, I suppose, because it's not about the policy. It's not doing something after the policy is, or like not doing something else in place of the policy. So it is technically still like a positive because it's not a negative. It's not like not doing the policy in this way. It's just like don't do the alternative to the policy that you think they will do. Um, the next one is the Arctic military might involve nuclear subs. Throwback to the Arctic militarization topic. Again, a negative GPS is just don't put nuclear subs in the Arctic militarization. There's no reason this has to be in there. It's definitely not intrinsic. And even if it might be part of one of the most likely cases, like it's certainly not like the most likely primary facet of militarization. We don't need this to have militarization at all. And so it seems like a perfectly fine practical solution to just not put the subs there. They say on the immigrants topic about like surveillance, they say farms will lose workers. Just subsidize the farms. That's an easy, positive, generalized practical solution. Just give them more money from the government. Easy solution. They say ending NSA surveillance of US citizens will also end NSA surveillance abroad. This was from way back, like January 2020 or something. The easy, positive, generalized practical solution is just separate them. Just separate NSA surveillance of US citizens from NSA surveillance abroad. Maybe it takes a little while, but it solves the link. The next one is if we reduce arms to Taiwan, it will freak out Japan on the Taiwan topic. Uh, Easy positive GPS, just tell them it's a special circumstance and warn them in advance. This is a good example because it's one that's not as powerful. Like the natural response to this is that that won't work, right? That they won't trust our assurances. Um, Instead of like freaking out about the rules of PF. Like the obvious response is that there's a solvency deficit here, that this solution is not sufficient to solve the link. The next argument is NATO security commitments to the Baltics will be troops that will threaten Russia. Like the form that these security commitments will take is in the form of deploying troops. This was also back at like a September topic a few years ago. The response is just don't make it troops. Don't make the security commitment troops. It doesn't have to be troops. It could be anything else, a million other things. As long as it's not troops, it seems like there's not a link. And so that's an easy, generalized, practical solution. What are the limitations of these responses? I think there are good examples of arguments that it's really hard to think of a generalized practical solution against. One is like, if we increase debt, this will destroy developing nations because it causes a trade-off with their bonds and investment. There's not a clear practical solution to solve that. It just seems like an economic fact. Um, One argument is nuclear energy is key to hegemony. I don't know how to like what's the generalized practical solution against that? There's no practical solution that just guarantees us hegemony, especially if their argument is that nuclear is key. Like, then I guess we need nuclear energy. There's no practical solution against this. The next one is nuclear energy will make factory farm operations cheaper. Again, I think there's no practical solution against this. This is an interesting one. It's an interesting case because this is an example of an argument that Parker LL ran at the King Round Robin, and a team from Plano West, AB, used a generalized practical solution to respond to this argument. But this is an interesting case because I think that the generalized practical solution did not actually apply to this argument, or at least Harker could have pointed out this was not a sufficient solution or was not a practical solution. So the response was just don't use nuclear energy for factory farms. The response to that, the front line, should be it is completely impractical to separate the use of nuclear energy from factory farms because it's connected to the grid. And so you would have to disconnect factory farms from the grid and then power the grid like without factory farms on it, which sounds completely impractical to me. So in this case, this is not a generalized practical solution. It doesn't really seem like a generalized solution either. Or maybe it's generalized, but it's certainly not practical, which means this is not a valid application of a generalized practical solution if you just contest the practicality of it. So that's an example of how you can respond to this. Other examples of how to respond without any theory. You can say it's not generalized. You can say it's not practical. You can say, on the other hand, it's too comprehensive or it's too formal, which means it's too much of a plan or counterplan, so it shouldn't be allowed. Or you can make arguments about solvency deficits, which are very easy. Like you can just say that this is not terminal. Maybe this is mitigatory, but it's very slightly mitigatory because there's a massive deficit in your solvency. Like if we tell Japan it's a special circumstance, they will just not believe us. And so it won't solve the link. And these are very useful to point out. If you are running a generalized practical solution, you should point out some of these at the end of the debate after they've already missed their chance to give these responses. Because then you can just point out how this is not really a different kind of argument. It just still functions under normal debate logic. They should have just given solvency deficits and things like that, which by the way would have been pretty easy responses in this case, but they just dropped the ball and they just didn't give these responses, which is why you should vote against them. The last thing I want to say about this is strategic coupling. I think that um, it is useful to make two arguments in one in some of these cases. Like the first one is the generalized practical solution. For example, just don't make the NATO security commitments troops because that's bad, like they say. But then at the same time, right after, you can say independently, it is also not likely that a NATO deployment would involve troops because of XYZ reason. These are two independent arguments. One says, using some sort of fiat magic, we propose a solution to this problem. The other one says, this kind of solution is likely, regardless of fiat magic, to happen. The difference, for example, is I could suggest that you don't get on a moped in Vietnam, or I could also say, knowing you, it is unlikely that you actually will get on a moped in Vietnam. You're scared of mopeds, I guess. And these are two different ways to reach the same conclusion. And it's useful to couple them together to make two at once, because it's two different paths to the same defense. And then just go for whichever one they don't respond to. However, the downside of this is that this could confuse the judges. If the judges think both of these are the same argument, then they will interpret answers to one as also being answers to the other. And this will confuse them thoroughly. So if you do use the strategy, be very clear that these are two independent arguments. And if you drop one, be very clear that you are dropping it and why the other one is different and does not have their responses apply to it. Don't make this seem tricky, right? Don't do any more than you have to. I think this really is a strategy for much later, like after this has been normalized a little bit. This is a way that you can use it better. The last thing I'll say is just like for people who are from LD and policy, I guess a good way of thinking about this is kind of like advantage counterplans. Just advantage counter. So an advantage counterplan, to be clear, a counterplan says there is an opportunity cost of doing the policy. It is this other policy that is mutually exclusive with the policy and would do something better. That's a counterplan. An advantage counterplan typically is not mutually exclusive with the policy. It's just we will do this other thing that solves some of the problems that are happening in the status quo. For example, if one of the advantages of the policy, let's say that the policy is do nuclear energy, right? Invest more in nuclear energy. One of the advantages is maybe warming. The uniqueness for this advantage, or I guess in policy, you would say the harms of the status quo are that warming is happening. We're reliant too much on fossil fuels. An advantage counterplan might be to say something like, we should um, we should develop carbon capture technology. If we invest a lot of money in carbon capture technology, we can solve warming. This is something that solves the impact. It sort of solves the harms. It says there's another way that we can solve the harms, which means that nuclear energy is not required. Obviously, there's a perm problem, right? Like the AF team will say, well, we can just do nuclear energy and carbon capture. But if the NEG is able to say that the carbon capture policy is a sufficient solution to warming, then a lot of the AF offense goes away. Maybe you're right. Maybe the AF solves warming even more than the advantage counterplan of carbon capture technology. But nonetheless, it will be solved a lot on both sides. And so it's not really a big problem we need to worry about. And so when you're comparing it to the other problems, like the disadvantages that the neg gives, it is a lower priority in the debate. It's not as much of a voter. It maybe doesn't lead to extinction because that extinction risk has been solved by carbon capture technology already. This is what an advantage counterplan is. It's designed to be permed. It's like, yeah, who cares? We can both have this. But the fact that we both have this means that it is a solution to the problem that you identify on both sides of the debate, which means you don't really have a lot of offense. My understanding of generalized practical solutions is they're kind of like baby advantage counterplans that can be used on both sides. And this actually makes a lot of sense in PF. Everyone who says, oh, this doesn't make any sense, is mostly people who are coming from policy or LD, or who assume policy and LD models apply to PF, which they just don't. There's a reason that the con can go first in public forum debate. There's a reason that neither side specifies anything about how the policy will be done. There's no plans, there's no counterplans, there's no perms, there's no anything. And so instead of thinking about these as in policy terms, where like it would be weird if the AF also could do advantage counterplans, think about them in PF terms, where it is designed such that everything is symmetric. For example, the topic would not meaningfully change if it was the United States federal government should not substantially increase investment into nuclear energy. Then you would just flip sides. The pro would become the con, and the con would become the pro. This like bamboozles the mind of a policy person or an LD person because PF is different, because PF is symmetric, because the AF does not have a burden of defending a plan of how to implement the resolution, and the neg does not have the burden of rejoinder of rejoining the AF. Uh, there should be no presumption of presuming neg because instead, the best way to view a public forum round is both sides are talking about a policy. One side is saying the pros of that policy are greater than the cons. The other side is saying the cons of that policy are greater than the pros. But neither side is proposing the policy. Neither side is proposing an alternative. They are just talking about the pros and the cons of this policy that the government might do. That's it, which is why there's this symmetry. The con can go first. And that means, yes, it kind of functions like advantage counterplans on both sides. Like the AF says, we can solve your DA in this other way. Yes, you can also do that thing. But the fact that we can do it means that your DA largely goes away. Um, all of that stuff can happen on both sides symmetrically, and it's totally fair. Um, if your argument is able to be taken out by a generalized practical solution, it's probably not an intrinsic argument to the topic. It's not something that is intrinsic as a pro or a con to the topic. And if it can be eliminated by a practical solution that's really obvious and intuitive, then it's probably not a very good argument. It probably is so niche and unintuitive that it should be taken out of the debate. That's my 2 cents. I think this is a real argument that is useful and is worth looking into. I will give some examples about how it can apply to different arguments on nuclear energy in a future video. But if you think this is an interesting argument, or if you don't think this is a very useful argument and you have beef with this because you're scared of new things, then leave a little comment and we'll talk further about it. But I think that there's something real here that should be explored. Thank you all for listening.